Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 11. Pepper. Virginia Potts had been born the youngest of 3 children and the only daughter. Most people, seeing her red hair, fair skin, and admittedly, even as a child, pretty face, had fully expected her to be a frilly, silly, vain thing. Very few people had been prepared for an intelligent, ambitious, mostly level-headed tomboy who insisted on being included in her brother's pursuits and had learned how to keep up with them. She'd earned her lifelong nickname of Pepper not for her temper, but for her willingness to stand her ground and refusal to back down in the face of resistance to her plans, bullies, or setbacks in general. She'd been a straight-A student throughout school and college and had earned a position in the Stark Industries secretarial pool. Most people would have considered that rather a disappointment to be merely another face in a faceless pool of workers, but Pepper had known that having a foot in the door at Stark Industries could take a person places. That said, even she hadn't, in her wildest dreams, anticipated just how far she personally would end up going. She'd been working with the company for a month, just long enough to have seen 10 different secretaries get dragged into working with the young Mr. Stark only to be fired or quit within days, sometimes hours. She's seen him storming about being his crass, idiosyncratic, demanding self, so when she in turn got thrown under the Tony Stark bus, she refused to let it be her downfall. Tony hadn't quite known what to do with a secretary who stayed calm in the face of the worst of his excesses, managed to organize his truly insane schedule, and refused to back down when he threw a fuss. He tried to fire her 4 different times in the next week, but Pepper had refused to take it seriously, and Tony hadn't actually informed anyone she'd been fired, so she'd kept her job by default. The longer she got to know Tony, the more she saw beneath the devil-may-care mask he wore in public. The more she saw of the real Tony Stark. And to her initial horrified dismay, she began to fall for him. There was no worse cliche than falling for one's boss, really. Especially when said boss was a billionaire several times over and so far out of Pepper's league, it was pitiful. She'd kept her mouth shut and her work faultless and had tried to forget all about it. And she had nearly succeeded. Until Tony didn't come back from Afghanistan. It was during the next frantic, heart-wrenching months that she realized she'd only been kidding herself. That she cared for Tony a great deal more than she ought and probably always would. Then he'd come back, thin and haunted and with a glowing light filling a hole in his chest. Driven and determined to... Well, to be honest, at first, Pepper hadn't been really clear on what Tony was planning for his future, or if he was even planning for a future at all. But she'd realized she had a decision to make, because after his return, Tony had been... Well, he'd stopped the over-the-top flirting with her. Instead, he'd become somewhat awkward and faintly serious, a complete change from his usual modus operandi with women. It hadn't taken much for Pepper to read between the lines to figure out the thing that Tony hadn't quite been up to saying then. And despite all the bad things that had followed, Stain, Franco, Tony almost dying, Pepper had never once regretted her decision. Because for all his faults, she loved Tony dearly, and she was determined to stand by him and support him. Oh, not without the odd freak-out, to be certain, and not without the occasional argument, but she wasn't about to leave him to this alone. To that end, she defended off S.H.I.E.L.D., except for Phil, who had proved to be level-headed and practical, and someone she definitely wanted on her side in the war to protect Tony from himself and his own good intentions. She'd done innumerable hours of work to ferret out Stain's plants in the board of directors and ensured they lost their jobs and were replaced by people who hadn't been paid to ignore the fact that Stain was dealing under the table. She'd even let Tony name her CEO when he needed more time away from the incessant meetings that came with that job. It wasn't like he'd ever liked the meetings or attended them without a lot of wrangling from her anyway. And Pepper certainly had a good idea of what needed to be done in that job after so many years with the company. Besides, who else could Tony just to keep the company going in the direction he wanted it to go? She'd even begun to put in more hours in the gym, determined to not only remain fit, but learn to defend herself well enough that she'd be, at the very least, able to slow any would-be kidnappers down. She was nothing if not a realist, after all, and anyone with half a brain and a grudge against Tony would go straight for her. Tony had told her most of his plans in regards to the Avengers if the team ever came together, and she'd agreed wholeheartedly. She'd helped as much as she could with the planning for the Avengers' quarters in the tower, but with the exact roster undetermined beyond 2 S.H.I.E.L.D. agents and Tony at first, there hadn't been much to do. Though Tony had insisted on adding preparations for Dr. Banner, whether he became an Avenger or not. After one good look at his file, Pepper had been all for tracking the man down and hauling him to the tower in relative safety then and there. She was going to enjoy crossing swords with General Ross when the time came. She truly was. How anyone could do those sorts of things to someone she would never understand. And then Phil had shown up last night, and if had turned into now. Pepper had done the only thing she could to remove herself from the potential danger zone so that Tony wouldn't have to worry about her. From the plane en route to Japan, she had begun to work with Jarvis and various SI employees to get ready for trouble. She hadn't quite been prepared for the sheer scope of the trouble, though. Watching the battle via the news had been horrifying. She nearly ended up crying when Tony had called, reassuring her that he was not only alive but unharmed, save for a few bruises and minor scrapes. She'd put her relief to good use, going into overdrive to ensure that she was ready to hit the ground running when she got back to the tower. They were going to be insanely busy for a long time to come. She was talking to Jarvis the moment she landed, confirming what Tony had already set up and setting up things he hadn't gotten to yet, confirming the tentative food supply orders Jarvis had put together for the Avengers and wanted someone to check his numbers, since he didn't have an appetite and Tony and her eating habits were not a reliable pool of data to work with. Despite Jarvis's warning, she wasn't quite ready for the crowd in the penthouse. And this, Jarvis had told her, was a lesser crowd than the one that had been here 2 hours previously. Several of the heroes of the hour had gone back out into the city to help find trapped civilians, patch up wounds, and start trying to clean up the mess. Logan, Jean, and Ororo were missing of the X-Men, as the other men on the team were all varying shades of obviously mutant. Of the Avengers, it looked like only Steve and Thor, and Phil of course, were missing, though she couldn't actually see Bruce. She presumed Bruce was in one of the guest rooms, sleeping off his transformation. She spotted Eric in the corner of the opposite side of the room from Loki, looking understandably unhappy. For once, she gave guests nary a thought and headed straight for Tony, needing to reassure herself that he really was as lightly injured as he'd claimed. Jarvis had backed him up, for once, but a verbal report was not as reassuring as a visual inspection. Of course, Tony being Tony, he wasn't about to settle for a mere smile and a hug. Not that she was complaining. When they came up for air, he had that oh-so-familiar shit-eating grin on his face. The one that said, yes, he was genuinely happy, but that he was also contemplating future Hillary and to beware. Aware of who his probable targets were this time, Pepper, for once, was not going to intervene. In point of fact, she might just offer up a few of her ideas to make things interesting. She didn't miss the fact he kept his arm around her, the grip tighter than usual, a silent reassurance. Pepper had long realized that Tony was no good at expressing himself verbally when it came to relationships and feelings, but that didn't mean he didn't care or didn't show it. "How was Japan?" he asked, as if she'd actually gone there, with all heck breaking loose. Not hardly. "It was nice. I was barely there long enough for the meeting. Really, Tony, I can't leave you alone for 5 minutes and you're getting into trouble," Pepper mock scolded. Tony clapped a hand over his reactor melodramatically. "You wound me, Miss Potts. I can go at least 10 minutes, maybe even 15. Pepper smiled at him. "I'll believe that when I see it. Will that be all, Mr. Stark?" "That will be all, Miss Potts." And Pepper was never ever going to tell anyone that somewhere along the way that old well-worn dismissal had somehow become code for "I love you," and "I love you too." What outsiders never knew wouldn't hurt them in this case. Having reassured herself that Tony was in one piece for once, she extricated herself from his side and headed over to the X-Men. "Warren, it's good to see you. It's been entirely too long." Pepper said, smiling up at Warren.
Good to see you too, Pepper. You still hanging around the old reprobate?
Warren asked.
Or are you ready to trade up?
He curled a wing partly around her. Pepper mentally rolled her eyes. Warren and Tony both flirted as easily as they breathed. And in Warren's case, he flirted with her because he enjoyed teasing Tony as much as Tony teased him. Case in point, here came Tony. Hey, quit hitting on my girl, sweetie, Tony said. He put one hand on the top edge of Warren's wing as if he was going to pet the feathers. That happened to Warren a lot and annoyed him when it was done by someone who hadn't been invited to do so. But Tony wasn't after petting the wings. Oh no, Pepper had seen this one played out multiple times in the past. Instead of petting the wing, he yanked at a feather that smirked when Warren squawked. You keep saying you're not really a bird, sweetie, but you sure sound like one, Tony said. Pepper ignored him for the moment. You guys should really be out there helping, she said. You can't buy better publicity than you'll be getting thanks to this. She was well aware of how tenuous the situation was for mutants at the moment. The Mutant Registration Act may have lost its most ardent supporter and a lot of its steam, but it hadn't been forgotten, and it could easily find another powerful supporter before too long. All of them hesitated for a long moment. They will not, Hank started. Hank, trust me. Go out there, help! They're hurting too bad right now to be picky, and later they'll remember that mutants came to the defense of the city and helped fix what got broken when the aliens showed up. You just might make some very powerful allies. Predictably, Hank was the first to cave. With his sweet nature and gentle heart, he would have been wanting to from the moment the dust had settled. Unfortunately, he'd had more than enough experiences of people freaking out about his appearance to make him hesitant. Perhaps I should, he finally said, and headed for the elevator. Talk to Lucy McCannon on the 3rd floor. She's with the Red Cross, Pepper called after him, and Pepper knew for a fact that Lucy didn't have any problems with mutants. Her cousin was one, and when he'd been thrown out of his home, Lucy had taken him in. She'd treat Hank right. I'll do that, Hank said. I will go with you, Hank, Kurt said after a moment, and hurried to join him in the elevator. Scott followed on his heels without Pepper having to argue with him, for which she was grateful. Well, that went well. Pepper turned to Gamut, who shook his head. Mon cher, he started. Pepper scowled at him. I know you can speak perfectly unaccented English, Remy, she pointed out. Remy pouted at her. Tony, you never told me she was a bully. Tony just laughed. How else do you think she manages to keep me, of all people, in line? He asked. Remy gave Tony an amused look. Point. Anyway, it's not good, me going out there. I'd had folks trying to help them. If you used your charges, yes. But you do happen to be exceedingly flexible and a hell of a gymnast. And how many people do you think they're going to have on hand who can wiggle into tight spaces? Pepper wanted to know. Remy said, You have a point, he said. All right, I'll go do my bit for human-mutant relations. But you're gonna owe me one. Pepper turned to Warren. They need eyes in the sky to spot all the fallen Chitauri soldiers and their gear, Warren said, forestalling her. I know, I'll go. He at least knew better than to try to fight her. He turned towards the balcony as the more convenient point of egress for him. Now to see if she could get the rest of the Avengers, sans Bruce, who wouldn't be in any shape moving. She turned to Clint and Natasha first and said 3 simple words. Exposure is good. She knew they would understand what she meant. The more public their faces, the less worth they had to shield, which would make the agency more likely to want to let them go and give them to the Avengers completely without a fight. They'd also have much greater protection against S.H.I.E.L.D. trying to make them disappear if they were in the public eye as known Avengers. They both took her meaning right away and headed towards the elevator. That left the 2 truly hard sells. Loki and Tony. To be completely honest, Pepper wasn't quite sure what, if anything, she could say to Loki to inspire him to render additional assistance. But then he surprised her. I suppose I had better go find Thor. Who knows what trouble he's gotten into without me to watch out for him, Loki said. Pepper fought down a smile, sure that Loki would eventually resort to actually helping out of sheer boredom after a while. She turned to Tony.
Nope, not happening. The Mark 6 isn't flight worthy, Tony tried.
And yet I happen to know the Mark 7 is ready for use, Pepper said. Better yet, that one has the jetpack, doesn't it? Which means you don't have to use the palm repulsors to stay level in the air.
Tony eyed her. I'm not going to win this one, am I?
Nope,
Pepper said. Fine, I'm collecting that IOU later, though. Still.
Pepper smiled. I wouldn't have it any other way. Now go help. I'll be here coordinating Stark Industries' response and the traffic in and out of the tower.
Among a good many other things. Right, see you later, Tony said, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek before he pulled back. Jarvis, get the Mark 7 into the assembler stations.
Already done, sir. You may deploy at any time.
A couple minutes later, it was just her, Eric, and a sleeping Banner in the penthouse. Eric eyed her with no small amount of awe. Did you just browbeat and bully an entire room full of... Well... Eric flailed a hand in a gesture that encompassed the room and the people that had been in it not too long ago.
I did indeed,
Pepper said, sounding just a touch rightfully smug.